Now, we all like anime. That is not a debate. The fact that you took time out of your day to click on this video shows how much you like anime. But the reason why yes, you got into anime along with me, along with most other anime fans, is because of something that stands out in anime a lot. What is something that makes anime so special? What makes anime anime? Well, I'll tell you. It's the intense, action-packed fight scenes. Now, if you're anything like me, you were probably a kid minding your own business until you somehow stumbled across a clip of some crazy fight showed in some anime, and that piqued your interest, and it was enough just to get you to try out anime and then fall in love with it. So yeah, it's safe to say that fights are a staple of anime. And if a series is missing this aspect, chances are people aren't going to enjoy it as much, because fights, especially good ones, are what makes anime so enjoyable in the first place. Now, there are hundreds and hundreds of different fights all across anime, and most of them revolve around the protagonist fighting against the main villain or some sort of side villain or even a group of villains in order to save his friends, family, and the world. And those fights are always great to read and watch, but they're just not as good as the one that I'm about to talk about. Because the hero versus villain fight may be exciting to see, but the villain versus villain fights will always go 100 times harder. Villain versus villain fights are easily the best types of fights in all of anime, and you cannot convince me otherwise. I have not seen a single villain versus villain fight occur and it not go ridiculously hard. Here's the thing with villain versus villain fights that hero versus villain fights are lacking. It's the ruthlessness factor. Now, heroes in most animes always have some sort of rule, some sort of morals and values that hold them back. They're not willing to do whatever it takes to win. Villains are, which is why a villain versus villain fight is always cooler, because the villains are going all out. There are no rules in a villain versus villain fight. It's all hands and everyone is doing whatever it takes to win. It is the definition of ruthless. Let's just run through some of the most iconic and greatest villain versus villain fights, just for me to prove that this type is always going to trump the good old classic and cliche hero versus villain. Let's start off strong with what I think is the greatest villain versus villain fight I have ever seen, that being Doppio versus Risotto from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 5, Golden Wind. One major reason why this fight already stands out is because it's the main antagonist, that being Doppio slash Diavolo, going up against the secondary antagonist of the part. So it's already the two biggest villains that we can get facing off against one another. This is also our first real introduction to both villains, because up until this point, we've never seen them fight. And the thing that makes this fight so amazing, y'all remember how I mentioned how villain versus villain fights are more ruthless? This fight is a prime example of that. I mean, right from the get-go, we can see the direction that this fight is going, because the fight starts off with Risotto instantly making Doppio throw up a mouthful of razor blades, and we can tell that there are no rules in this fight. Nothing matters. All this is a test to survive, and it keeps getting worse and worse as the fight is going on, because Risotto seems to be completely playing around with Doppio at this point. Later on in the fight, he forces him to have to rip out a pair of scissors straight from his throat. So, in terms of violence, this already trumps most other anime fights. And we can see that Risotto's way of fighting differs very greatly from every other hero's way of fighting, because Risotto is playing dirty. He is attacking him, and he is quickly disappearing, camouflaging his body, and just keeps doing that over and over, and slowly starts draining Doppio of all of his iron in order to win the fight. And that is, again, a prime example of what makes villain versus villain fights so great. It's the unfairness about them. No one fights fair. That is such an amazing and breath of fresh air thing to see in anime. A lot of anime fights are about honor, respect, things like that. With villain versus villain fights, there is no respect. There is no honor, and we see it with this fight. And even with Risotto playing smarter, playing more unfairly, completely annihilating Doppio in every single aspect in this fight, he still loses because despite Doppio being immensely weaker, he has an ability Risotto doesn't. Being able to look into the future. And this one broken ability completely trumps everything Risotto has. And Risotto ends up defeated. Despite being the better fighter, despite having the better plan, the result was frankly unfair. But again, that's how it works with villain versus villain fights. And that is all of the reasons why I believe that the Doppio versus Risotto fight from JoJo's is probably the best example of a villain versus villain fight that we can get. Moving on to another extremely popular series, we have Naruto. And what I'm going to talk about is Sasuke's fights, because Sasuke, for the most part of the series, was a villain. So he got to throw down with some other villains, such as Deidara, Itachi, and Danzo. And for this one, I'm going to specifically talk about his fight against Danzo, because this was another insanely ruthless fight. Sasuke instantly goes for the kill against Danzo, no questions asked, something that usually never happens in a hero versus villain fight. And despite Sasuke not holding anything back, neither is Danzo, because he is playing as unfairly as it can get. He has every single ability that doesn't belong to him, that is just keeping him in this fight and giving him more chances to resurrect himself and come back in order to try to defeat Sasuke. Sasuke literally opens up the fight by completely crushing Danzo's body with his Susanoo. Tell me where else or in what other type of fight you're gonna see something like that. Another reason why these fights are always amazing. Towards the end of the fight, Danzo takes Karin as a hostage, and if this was any normal anime main character, they'd practically be defeated at this point, because they're not going to sacrifice an innocent person's life in order to get to someone that they need to defeat. That goes against their moral code. However, that doesn't apply for villains, because Sasuke shoots completely right through her in order to hit Danzo, sacrificing her in order to take him out, because once again, he has no rules. He has no morals. Nothing is holding him back. This next fight I'm going to talk about is a short one, but I just have to talk about it, especially if I'm talking about villain fights, because once this fight gets animated, man, the internet is going to go crazy, because this is one of the most hype fights I have ever seen, and not just in terms of villain fights, hype fights in general. And I am talking about Aizen versus Yuha at the end of 1,000 Year Blood War. Again, this is a shorter one compared to the other ones, but you cannot tell me you were reading 1,000 Year Blood War and you were not resisting the urge to absolutely start jumping up and down from excitement after seeing Aizen pull up on Yuha. The reason why this fight is so different, the reason why it stands out so much compared to the other villain fights, is because Aizen isn't just a side villain. He was the former main villain of the Bleach series. In fact, some people might say that he is still the main villain of the Bleach series. But Yuha, simultaneously, is also the main villain of the Bleach series. So it's not the main villain fighting against the side villain. It's the two main villains of the entire series squaring up with one another. And another reason why this fight is so good is because Aizen is literally the last hope for these guys to win. Everybody lost. And the ironic part is that just a few arcs ago, Aizen was the biggest enemy of the Soul Society. Yet now, he's their only savior. Like, yeah, hero versus villain fights will always be fun to watch. Don't get me wrong. People will always love to see the main character and the villain be introduced very early on and watch the main character's progression throughout the entire series up until he fights the main villain. And people, in the end, will most of the time be satisfied with what they see. It is the most classic shonen trope. You cannot go wrong with it. But there are just so many less rules and boundaries when it comes to creating a villain versus villain fight that just makes it so much more enjoyable to watch, because at that point, we don't know what to expect. It's not a generic shonen fight. Anything could happen because these characters are unpredictable and they're not holding back. And there are so many other villain fights in anime that I just didn't have time to mention. So I only went over the most iconic ones. But every single villain fight I have ever seen has never disappointed. I have never watched a villain versus villain fight and walked out feeling underwhelmed. They always hit, no matter what. Anyways, with all that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and make sure to like and subscribe, and let me know what other videos you guys want to see in the future. I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you guys on the next one.